Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about something pretty serious. It's the impact of President Trump's foreign aid freeze and how it's impacting South African universities.
Yeah, this is a big one. And what's really interesting is it's not just about the money. This freeze, it's sending shockwaves.
Yeah.
I mean, we could be talking about like setbacks in global health security, a resurgence of diseases, and all of it because of the freeze in research, healthcare, and funding.
Right. Okay, so let's sort of unpack this a little bit for our listeners. Back in January, Trump froze foreign aid, and now, boom, we're seeing the impact in real time. Especially in South Africa, their universities are getting hit, like from both sides. Public health programs and their research.
It's like a double whammy.
Right.
And it's left them in this crazy limbo, and they're just trying to figure out, like, what programs can even continue? Like, are there any exemptions? And it's all super confusing because there are actually two main funding streams involved.
Two funding streams.
Yeah, two funding streams. So the first one, it comes from PEPFAR, USAID, and the CDC. They've been funding, like, public health initiatives, HIV/AIDS treatment, and even some medical research.
Okay. Yeah.
This is the stream that Trump's order directly froze.
Makes sense. And the second stream.
So the second one comes from the NIH, that's the National Institutes of Health, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And for now, that funding, it's still flowing. But there's a lot of worry that it could be next. I mean, Professor Ntobeko Ntusi, he's the CEO of the South African Medical Research Council, and he's saying cutting NIH funding would basically be like bringing medical research in South Africa to its knees.
Wow. So on one hand, there's this, like, immediate freeze on critical funding. And on the other hand, there's this looming threat that could just wipe out medical research in South Africa. It's a lot for these institutions to handle. But what does this mean for people on the ground? You know, like those who really depend on the HIV/AIDS programs?
Sadly, the situation, it's really bad. Community health workers, outreach teams, and NGOs who depended on that U.S. funding, they're now left high and dry. No resources. Mark Haywood from the Treatment Action Campaign, he called the decision a disaster and immoral, which, I mean, that's a really powerful statement. It shows just how much this freeze is going to hurt people.
It's just heartbreaking, especially for those who rely on these services. Didn't they issue some kind of waiver, though? Could that help?
Yeah, there was a waiver. Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued one for life-saving humanitarian assistance under PEPFAR. But there's a problem.
There's always a catch. What is it?
Well, Haywood says that basically the USAID office in Washington is shut down.
Yeah.
So there's nobody to actually administer the waiver. Good intentions, but red tape.
Oh, man. So even with a waiver, there's no real help. What's happening to those clinics that relied on this funding?
A lot of the clinics that depended on the U.S. money for things like HIV/AIDS testing, counseling, follow-ups, they've had to scale back. Some have even had to shut down completely.
Ugh, this is all so troubling. And I can't help but think, aren't certain communities being hit even harder by all of this?
Yes, absolutely. Rubio's waiver specifically excludes funding for any gender or DEI ideology programs and transgender surgeries. So that means LGBTQI plus support initiatives, they're taking a direct hit.
Wow. So you're talking about targeting a vulnerable group and making them worry about funding. Yeah, this is a mess. What have we heard from people about this exclusion?
Christy Kruger from the University of Pretoria, her center actually doesn't rely on U.S. funding. But she has been very vocal about the message this sends to the LGBTQI plus community. Basically, it's like saying you are not worth funding, which, on top of everything else, now you have these human rights concerns.
Yeah, it really adds another layer to the problem. Speaking of, how are the universities themselves dealing with all of this? It seems like they're at the heart of it.
Yeah, and remember, a lot of the HIV/AIDS treatment programs, they depend on partnerships with universities to do the research and put things into action. So this freeze, it cuts off funding for doctors, nurses, researchers, everyone who is working on these initiatives.
Right, and it all comes back to this tangled web of healthcare, research, and funding, and this freeze has just thrown a wrench into the whole thing.
Exactly. And a lot of people were completely blindsided. I spoke to a senior university official who wants to stay anonymous, and they said that they didn't see this coming. Not this fast and not this widespread, especially the impact on current programs.
So they're scrambling to adjust. What are they doing about the legal and financial side of things? I mean, everything changed overnight.
That's the tough part. South African labor laws make it hard to let staff go quickly. But then there are no guarantees about funding. It puts universities in a very, very difficult spot. Legally, financially, like trapped.
It's got to be incredibly stressful. I'm getting the feeling that people are pretty hesitant to talk about all this openly. Am I right?
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of fear. And silence. People are afraid to speak out. One source even told me no one wants to draw attention to themselves because we are dealing with a very vindictive situation.
So it's more than just budget cuts and logistics. It's this whole atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. It's really complicated.
It is. This really shows how vulnerable universities are when they depend on foreign aid. There are no easy answers here, and the consequences could be really bad.
We've covered a lot of ground here. The disruptions in healthcare, the funding worries, targeted exclusions, this whole climate of fear that's gripping South Africa. But before we get into the long-term effects on research and possible solutions, let's take a break. We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive into the fallout from the U.S. foreign aid freeze. Okay, so we're back, and now let's talk about research. I mean, this whole thing with the NIH funding, it feels like a ticking time bomb.
It really is. And as we've been discussing, South Africa relies heavily on those NIH funds. Professor Ntusi, he made it clear it's the single largest recipient of NIH funding outside of the U.S. If that disappears, well, the impact will be huge.
Yeah, it's like a domino effect. And we can't ignore it. What happens if that NIH funding dries up? What are we looking at?
The immediate impact. It would be a disaster. Projects would be stopped in their tracks, researchers would lose their jobs, and South Africa's scientific output would plummet. And you also have to think about all those aspiring scientists who would lose out on training opportunities.
So it's not just about right now. We're talking about potentially destroying an entire system of research. What about the long term? What are the lasting consequences?
One of the biggest concerns is what we call a brain drain. The best researchers, they'll see that there's no opportunity in South Africa, so they'll pack up and go to countries where the funding is more stable.
And that's a huge loss for South Africa. But isn't it also a loss for the global scientific community? These discoveries, they often have implications that go way beyond borders.
Exactly. This situation, it really highlights how interconnected the global research community is. A discovery in South Africa could have huge implications for treating diseases all over the world. And if we cut off funding to one place, it could have ripple effects everywhere.
It makes you realize how important it is for science to be collaborative. So with all these potential consequences, what's being done? Is there anything we can do to mitigate the damage?
The South African government isn't just sitting around. They're definitely trying. They've been doing a lot of diplomacy, trying to salvage things. Health Minister Aaron Motsoaledi, he just met with a U.S. embassy official, and there's even a high-level delegation going to Washington soon to try to plead their case, maybe get some exemption.
I think they're pulling out all the stops.
Yeah. But this whole situation, it brings up a bigger point that's kind of unsettling. It shows just how much South Africa depends on U.S. aid for both public health A&D research.
Yeah, it's a real wake-up call. They're probably going to have to completely rethink their funding strategies, find other options.
Right. This could be a turning point. They might start looking at collaborations with European institutions, maybe partnerships with private foundations, even crowdfunding. Who knows?
So in all this uncertainty, maybe this crisis will force them to become more self-reliant and maybe even diversify their funding sources.
It's possible. It could be a blessing in disguise. This whole mess might push them onto a new path, one that ensures their vital sectors can sustain themselves in the long run.
So we've talked about how research might be completely crippled and the race for diplomatic solutions. For you, what stands out as the most important part of this whole foreign aid freeze?
For me, it's how connected everything is. It's not just about some budget cuts. It's about the fact that research, healthcare, global health, and the future of science, they're all tied together, and they're all hanging in the balance.
And if that balance is disrupted, the consequences could last for generations. But what happens next? That's the big question.
It is. Will other countries step up, organizations, private donors, or will funding for all these crucial things just disappear? Will HIV/AIDS research and treatment suffer?
These are big questions, and the answers will really shape the future of global health and scientific progress. This whole situation in South Africa, it's like a warning sign for the rest of the world.
I agree. And it's not over yet. We need to keep watching this very closely. The stakes are just too high to ignore. It's like we're watching this train wreck in slow motion. We see the damage that's coming, but we can't look away. This situation in South Africa, it's like it exposed this weakness in how we fund global health and research. It's a really bad sign. That's a good way to put it.
Right.
And the thing is, the damage from this train wreck, it could go way beyond South Africa. If the U.S., which has always been such a big player, if they back out, who's going to step in?
That's the question, isn't it? Will other countries see how serious this is and fill the gap? What about organizations, philanthropists? Or will funding for all this important research and public health stuff just dry up?
Honestly, that's what keeps me up at night. Think about it. Some breakthrough in South Africa, it could change how we treat diseases everywhere.
Yeah.
And it works the other way, too. Cutting funding to one region, it could have consequences globally.
It really shows that this isn't just about South Africa. This is about the future of global health, scientific progress, the whole thing.
It makes you think, right?
Yeah.
And it really emphasizes how important it is to have different sources of funding. We have to encourage countries to work together, and we need to keep fighting for the support of research and public health. They're vital.
It's like a call to action for governments, institutions, for everyone, really. We need to understand how important these things are and work to make them successful.
Exactly. This situation is awful, there's no denying that. But maybe it's a chance to rethink our priorities. Maybe we can build a better, fairer system for global health and research.
So we're at the end of our deep dive, and it feels like we have more questions than answers. But one thing's for sure, this whole global health and research funding landscape, it's changing big time.
And those changes will have a huge impact on the future. It's a story that's still unfolding, and we need to keep a close eye on it.
Absolutely. To everyone listening, please stay informed, talk about these issues, think about how you can contribute to a future where science and global health aren't controlled by politics or budget cuts. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.